Hello, guys. David Vos here. Oh, buddy, it's a beautiful day. Sun's coming up over the horizon, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. You know, I have just been on a deep dive for the last I don't know how many days, 3 days or more, 3 or 4 days, and I haven't had time to do a video. I really wanted to get a video yesterday. I've been doing a lot of work around here uh, and researching because there had been a lot of questions in my mind. There were some questions that I didn't have answers to yet. And I always believe in my heart that I can get the answers. But it's crazy because I've been trying to get these answers my entire life, and what I found out, or what I'm finding, and I really don't know if other people have this realization or this same eerie, odd knowing that I have. But as I confirm, or as I'm beginning to find facts that confirm more and more everything I've been saying, I mean, the more facts you get, the more you can know something, you can have been told something. But to see more facts on top of facts, and then you start thinking about what it really means. I just keep thinking about it all the time. I mean, let's say 10 years ago, if I'd have thought, well, oh my goodness, the government's trying to kill us. Well, that should just be like, what? But I'm still pondering this. I'm still uh, bewildered and amazed by the thought. And I think it's because I get the feeling like, well, this is information and I've known for a long time. And I've told y'all for a long time. In the last 10, 15 years, I've been doing these videos. But at the same time, I used to have these feelings and I used to know these things even before. I couldn't talk about it much in those days. I mean, I didn't have a channel. In those days, people didn't talk about stuff like this. And no, people would have thought you were nuts if you'd have started talking about chemtrails or something like that, or the earth is flat. When I was younger, I mean, now it's just everybody believes some crazy thing like this. But it's funny how all these kind of weird conspiracies are going around, like the earth is flat, or there's chemtrails, and there's the doctors are killing us. I mean, I don't know how long it took people to figure that out. I knew that when I was a little boy. And it was a big thing for me, even when I was growing up in my teens. I used to look at people like they were the oddest breed of ignorant fools I'd ever met. They were all running to the doctor. They had a sniffle. They were all just clueless, like as if almost like the way when I look at my dogs or my cats. And I love their little souls, but they don't have any deep thought. They are not aware of what's going on in the news right now. They're just content and they're innocent, and I take care of them, and I love them, and I know that they're not capable of understanding all of these difficult questions. But I've often thought that that's how most people are, and I don't know. Maybe people do have some profound thoughts in the quiet time of their lives, and they just don't talk about it because they too feel that people would laugh at them or whatever. But I've often thought that they have these ideas, but they're completely wrong. They come up with weird, like, oh, I wonder if the great pumpkin is going to rise up out of the pumpkin patch this year. I mean, like, they have these weird beliefs that aren't logical. They don't have any. I think part of it is that, Francis Bacon says knowledge is power. And it really is true. Knowledge is power. Even if it doesn't, if you don't have enough knowledge, which, might be difficult to do, to really have political power or to defeat all the minions of evil in the world, that doesn't mean that your knowledge doesn't give you certain power. I mean, it gives you a certain knowing, a certain peace of mind, a certain direction that you know is the correct path. I mean, if you didn't know, you'd go to a doctor and they might kill you, right? If you know that you need to watch out for things like that, like if you're living in New York and you know that you're living in a bad neighborhood and you shouldn't walk alone at night, that's good knowledge because it might save your life. So knowledge is power in just many ways. But, the part that I enjoyed is just the knowing, putting it all together so that I knew what this world really was. Like, let's say Jim Carrey in The Truman Show figured out that he was living inside of a contrived, world. Well, even if he didn't get out of that world, if he was still stuck in there, couldn't figure out how he could get out of there. He walked for miles and never got to the end of the bubble or whatever. Just knowing that he was in a contrived environment would have changed his life. It might have made it worse because now he's not going to be able to believe that these are really his friends when he meets them. He's like, are they actors? But you see, I would rather know that these people are not my friends. They're all actors. Even if it caused me to be very sad and lonely. But I thrive on knowledge. I want to know why these people are so ridiculous and the little oddities, that I see in the world. I want to know why. But ultimately, I do believe that it's important to know this knowledge, the truth, not just so that we can ponder greater realities, but even if it's just for the reason that I know that I'm not just an innocent, dumb animal that doesn't, I mean, I don't like calling animals dumb. I love my animals. They're not dumb. Sometimes I think it would be better off if we didn't know anything. Like the animals, we could just be happy and run around and play and chase our tail. But I would gladly give up that carefree life and that sense of all is good in the world and just running around and enjoying my life. And I would gladly accept a life of constant suspicion, anxiety, maybe a little anxiety. I mean, it might cause anxiety to know that somebody's about to kill you, but at the same time, it gives me a sense of well-being to know that I'm aware of bad things. I can maybe mitigate some of the evils. I mean, I might be carefree and happy and then end up in the hospital dead if I didn't know what doctors were and what these pharmaceutical drugs were. I don't want to end up in that hospital or in that morgue. So, I mean, I'd trade a little bit of anxiety and, some might call it paranoia. It's not paranoia if it's the truth. If you're really being hunted by evil, apparently non-good alien weirdos, I'd rather know that there are these people trying to hunt me, and therefore I can stay aloof, plan accordingly. And so, I don't know what what it would be. I often wonder what the percentage of people in the world that know anything about any of this. You talk to people and you'll bring stuff like this up and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I know." Sometimes they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'm aware of that." Or I've heard this, or I get what you're saying. But then you look at their life and you don't see them doing anything about it. And so you really wonder if they're aware or not. Some people will just tell you whatever you want to hear. And a lot of people do have an awareness that something's wrong, but they may not know exactly what it is. Just as a weird feeling that something's wrong. Or, there's a lot of mentally ill people in the world that are paranoid, literally out of their minds, fearing something that's not real. And, if you have knowledge, you really don't, maybe you aren't really as afraid as you would be otherwise, because if you didn't have knowledge, but you were human, you'd probably realize somebody was out to get you. You're driving down the road, you might get a ticket. Some cop parked on the corner, or if you don't know the laws where you live and you don't know how to get a permit to build this, or you're not aware of how to make a garden, well, then you're going to be subject to the poisons in town. So it's definitely better to know, and not just to know how, but to have this understanding that you must do this and that to mitigate these problems. Then you feel actually better in the long run. You may look crazy to everybody else, but at least you are aware. And I think that helped, because a lot of people are just kind of aware subliminally that there's a lot of bad things going on and they don't know who they can trust. And that gives them an anxiety that they can't do anything about. But when you have knowledge, then you know who it is that's really after you and what they're really after. And in the end, it really gives you a lot of peace, because I find I have a lot of peace. I'm not really worried or afraid of the world, because I know of the Christ in me. And I know that I'm going to live forever in a beautiful world that makes sense. I have made sense out of the world. I understand it. I know that it is a good world. I know why the evil exists. And by the way, I know where it's coming from. And I want to share some of this with you today. Some of you have seen a lot of these conspiracies and things, and we've talked about it here. And I have to say, I have found some information out over the last few days that changes a little bit about what is going on with, well, several things. One, whether or not the buildings that were here in America, like in Chicago, the World's Fair, did they just build it in 2 years and then burn it down, or was it already there? Well, this is the kind of information that I've been researching, and I've found some information that you've got to hear for those who are really interested, even just those who are curious. But we're going to talk about the new information that I've uncovered, and it's a lot. I honestly think that nobody on this earth now has ever heard this information I'm about to share with you. And it's not just a little bit. Like, I'm going to be able to spend hours on hours talking to you about the most curious circumstances you've ever heard. You might have heard glimmers of little rumors about some of these things that we're going to talk about. But I have the facts. I've spent days acquiring literal facts to all these crazy questions. And I've discovered that they really did build Chicago in, evidently a couple of years, and then just burned it down. But now I know why. So, like I said, I have so much information. Let's start with the Chicago and the buildings and the architecture here in America and the dates. I said we're going to do a lot of in this series, and this is going to be at least 5 videos in a row. I don't know, because I literally, there's no way I could tell you everything that I want to tell you in today's video. And I don't think I could do it in the next 2 or 3 videos. So I don't know how long we're going to be on this, but don't worry. If we spend the rest of the time we have on this planet talking about these things, you will not be disappointed, because I have got, I mean, it's not just one subject anyway. We're going to talk about the architecture and the prisons and the asylums like we were talking about, but again, the American history, why, what is this new Franco and the Catholic French and the orphan trains, and what's I mean, we're going to prove and show you the details of why. I don't think you've ever heard, I don't think anybody's ever put this together. Ever. Ever. This has been hidden and covered over. We have clues and little ideas that float around that nobody has ever figured it out. It's just a big mystery. But the mystery doesn't start there in 1914 or 1893 when they built the World's Fair in Chicago. There is stuff that is related to this, the reason the evil people exist, why they're evil, what they're trying to do, and who these good people are. We're going to go back to France, the Languedoc, Mary Magdalene, the Knights of St. John. We're going to go back to Francis Bacon. You know, I remember when I very first started really thinking about some of these things and pondering people like Newton and Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and wondering, were these really good people? Because, you know, I was raised in a cult, Jehovah's Witnesses, who told me that all of those people were pagans, they were all immoral, they were in the occult. But I didn't know, and you don't know if you haven't done the research that I've done. You don't really know what you're saying. You're just assuming, because we don't really have the facts. I mean, based on, when I was Jehovah's Witness, it was just based on, oh, well, they celebrate Easter, so they're pagan. But I didn't think, well, if they just celebrated Easter, they're evil. But I thought, well, if they celebrated Easter, then they're ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. That's pagan. So I didn't think that anybody who was off flitting around celebrating Christmas and Easter and going to Mass on Sundays knew anything about anything. But over the years, I've learned a lot. And I've learned that there's a lot of backwards and upside down information going on here. And I wanted to get to the bottom of all of this. So this is another whole aspect. This is what is all of this paganism? What is the pagan temples? Nobody ever asked the question, okay, why did all the nations have these magnificent, grandiose temples? And I thought, well, I guess as a witness, Jehovah's Witness, we were told, well, the devil, he's a bruiser, and he does all this pomp and this evil, and he's just building these huge temples because he's evil, trying to lure all the world into some evil. But I never stopped to think about, wait a minute, the real evil is modern people today who give us half-truths and little pieces, but never really give us the answers. I didn't know about, even though Charles Russell knew about Enoch and the pyramid and believed that the pyramid was written with valuable information, a second Bible. I don't know whether he really understood anything about it further, or whether he just couldn't tell people more than that. I don't know if Charles Russell was evil. There's a lot of weird things. Sometimes you look at these people like, I don't know, Manly P. Hall or any of these guys, and you wonder, they seem to be aware of certain intriguing facts and knowledge, but did they really know what they were talking about? And I don't think so. And I'm going to show you today that anyone you've ever heard try to explain any of this stuff in history, they didn't really know what was going on, and we do know today. And it's going to entail going through the Arthurian legends. We're going to talk about the line of the Plantagenets that goes back It's a line that goes back to Anjou in France on the Rhine. And it's the word Plantagenet is the word plant. It means the vine. And it is the vine or the holy lineage of Christ. And we can trace it. We're going to talk about the Stuart line. I said we were going to talk about American history. Well, we're going to get to that. But in order to understand American history, I've got to take you back to the cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral, on the River Thames in London, and the top of the hill. In America, we don't think about stuff like that. I don't know if they think about stuff like that in Britain. Do they look at that big building, St. Paul's Cathedral, and do they say, oh, that's an important building? Like in America, we know, oh, Washington, D.C., that's our capital. There's some history there. We don't know a lot about it or why they built it, but, we're aware that the Masons came in and built the whole city with ley lines and weird symbols and occult symbols and weird obelisks and we're like, well, we don't know what that's all about, but it's got to be something crazy, And most Christians think it's all evil, but yet most Christians are just following the government, and so it's like schizophrenia in everybody's mind. They don't know what to think or what to believe. But have you ever wondered, well, if these Masons were here in America and building this great dome, if they were so interested in building a dome and an obelisk, what did they know that they didn't tell us? Why? I mean, does this go back to, it goes back to Egypt, obviously. Did you know that in New York, in the park there, they have a obelisk that they brought over from Egypt that they say is Cleopatra's Needle? Well, I now know exactly what needle it is, and it is actually Cleopatra's Needle. But do you know that it was a twin obelisk, and that the male obelisk that goes with it, they were in Egypt, they were together, these two obelisks. One was Cleopatra's and one was Julius Caesar's. And they were married, they were together, and they were in Egypt. And they were in what was called the Caesareum, like Caesareum, like at a museum, right? So it was a place that was more like a museum or a sacred temple dedicated to originally Ra and Nut. And those two pillars were dedicated to Ra and Nut, and also were the pillars of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and the seventh. And they literally, whoever runs the world, and this occult, these mystery cults, thought it was so important to drag both of them. The Julius Caesar one they put in London, right next to St. Paul's Cathedral. And the female one they brought over here. Now, I believe that there is something going on with a particular needle, or Cleopatra's Needle, with a particular obelisk that was actually at Chicago, and that they supposedly burned down. I think they made it out of paper mache, or they plastered. It was all hollow, it was all fake. We're going to get into why they did it. It was a ritual, and we'll prove this. They burned it down in a ritual to destroy Caesar and Cleopatra and the lineage of Christ. And that's why we're going to have to go back and talk about St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, the St. Paul's Cathedral that's there today looks identical to the Vatican, or very similar to Washington, D.C., with the dome and all that Greco-Roman style. And then across the River Thames is this obelisk, and it's very, similar situation there on the Potomac, right? But what people don't know, and I don't even think people in Britain even think about these things or know much about it. When they look at that cathedral, do they say, oh, that's the chief place, that's the home of the gods. That's what it's all about. That's why certain individuals long time ago came to England and established this city as the kind of the city that runs the world at that time, the world power, and what they were doing with all these statues and obelisks. I don't think anybody knows. But we're about to tell you, and it has so much to do with understanding the world and why there's a Washington and why that, all these whys. But in 1066 AD, 1,000 years ago, St. Paul's Cathedral burnt down. It was burnt down the same way that they burnt down Chicago, with another dome-looking Greco-Roman style building and an obelisk and a statue called the Golden Lady. The Golden Lady was, well, they don't tell you who it was, but it was probably Mary Magdalene. And in her hand, she has a staff. And on the top of the staff was a liberty cap. This is very important symbolism. And this is what was throwing me for a while, because I was like, okay, this city had to have been built by the good guys, the Huguenots, the Pilgrims, because there's the liberty cap, and that's a sign that it goes back to Mary Magdalene. And I started finding out more and more about all the early pilgrims and how some of the Huguenots came with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, and there were other Huguenots that had been here before. And then there was a whole other group of French Catholics that took over the New Frank, and those are the ones who did the orphan trains and tried to murder and put up the asylums, and then we got the KGC. But we got to know why they're doing all this. They were here on a trail to extinguish the seed, the holy seed. Oh man, we've got so much to tell you guys. But instead of it being the good guys who built that Golden Lady, and they may have, we don't know exactly what was going on. There may have been a real one. But what the bad guys did in 1893 is they built a mock statue of Mary with the liberty cap. And then they had a ceremony and burned it down. And literally the Masonic conniving occult Satanists took that statue and had a ceremony after it was I think 1896. They had this ceremony where they burned it. They stuffed rags and fuel so that it would really catch fire and get extremely hot, and it would just burn it to ashes. And it was a ritual to end the power of the Christ line. This story's going to end up talking about Princess Diana, who was of the line of the Stuarts, that Prince Charles, then Prince, now King, married her. In his mind, they thought they were going to destroy that line forever. So they married her, and then they murdered her on Pont d'Almont, or whatever the Point Alma, de Pont Alma, or something like that. It was a ancient satanic altar where they killed Princess Diana. The whole story about Harry Potter is about this ritual. That's the number one seller. It sold as many copies almost as the Bible. Harry Potter is one of the biggest sellers of all time. I think the biggest seller of all time. And it's about this evil, wicked plot of the devil to destroy the line of Christ. And just briefly before we move on, I'm not going to get into the details of all of these little things. I'm just giving you a brief outline of a lot of things that we need to talk about. It all connects. But Princess Diana that word Diana goes back to Dinah, Jacob's daughter, who married Sechem, that produced Asenath, that Joseph married and produced the promise of the birthright to become a multitude of nations. And then this ends up somehow going to England, and they are a commonwealth of nations, and then how we'll get into all of that. And the royal line of King David, who, by the way, has ancestry to Joseph, the birthright, the king, comes down several ways through Jeremiah, who brought a lineage to Ireland. We'll get into that eventually. We've got Dan, who went off on his ships and became the Tuatha De Danann. And we've got the King Arthur legends and how that fits in with it. And then we've got this line of Christ and Mary Magdalene that goes down through a line that they call the Plantagenet. And it literally means the plant or the vine, the holy line or the Fisher Kings. And this goes from Anjou, France. They are, run out of France in the Inquisitions, the Waldensian Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. Will go to the Huguenot persecution. And they go and they flee up to Britain. And when they get there, this royal woman, Joan Plantagenet, which is also where we get Joan of Arc as we go along. We'll talk about this. She was this holy seed from Peter Waldo, which there was nobody named Peter Waldo. Peter means like Petra or the father. And Waldo means of the valley. So he was the Pope or the rock. It is reminiscent of Peter. Upon this stone, I'll build my church. But Peter's also the Pope or the father, because that word can mean father or rock. And this word Waldo is this Vaudios. The Vaudios means the people of the valley. And Vox, which is the way they said it in the old French, meant the valley. And in several of these stories, it's come down as Percy Val, or it could be Peter Vox or Waldo. It has different ways of spelling it. Pierre Valdez. But this person might not have really been one man. He might have been too. We don't really know, how these things work. But whoever he was, that wasn't his name. This is a title. And he was the father king, the high father of the Fisher Kings. And the story about his wife being put in a cottage and giving a little stipend to her. So he gave all of his wealth to the poor, is the story, but left his wife with a little cottage and a little stipend. She wasn't very happy about it, but he had 2 daughters, and he sent the daughters to a convent. And he became a beggar or some homeless person wandering around the streets. The most wealthy person, that's what the story indicates, is he was this man of great wealth who owned France. But he wasn't a man of great wealth who owned France. He was the church of Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ, and that lineage of Christ. Mary Magdalene was the high princess of Egypt and had all the wealth. Cleopatra had all the wealth of Egypt, and she conquered Persia, all the Middle East, and was a co-regent with Julius Caesar. So they had all the wealth in all the world. And when Augustus Caesar tried to take it and he murdered them, don't you worry, they stashed it away and they never got it all. They got very little of it. But they ended up taking it to France and they buried it, and they've been trying for years to try and find where all this wealth went. And that's where John, who was knighted to protect the Holy Grail, but he was also to protect the holy relics and all the knowledge and wisdom. And so they were down there until the Holy Roman Empire came along and tried to persecute them, run them out. So this holy line is along the Rhine, owns 169 cities, towns, and villages, meaning they own the whole area. All the commerce and everything from Marseille, France, Montpellier, Lyons, all the way up to this Anjou. And at this place, there was this monastery or this church, a cathedral. And this was the place where the Plantagenets were, and this is the convent where Peter Waldo sent his 2 daughters. And so they were the royal heirs, and the Plantagenet line then was there. And the story about his wife being left destitute in a little cottage is really a parable about the church that was left there in France. While the plant, the little yellow vine is what it was called, the plant, left with the two daughters. They went over the Alps and they went to England and they married the High King of the Welsh, who was the lineage of Cadwallader, who was of the line of King Arthur. And that was the ancient line that Jeremiah brought with Tia-Tifi from Egypt that was there for a long time. And we're going to eventually get into, the 1,000-year reign of Christ and John, the knight that protected the Holy Grail, and how he took her up there and they, for 1,000 years, were living in a kingdom of peace. And there are prophecies that we'll talk about where they had said for 1,000 years there that they would be in peace, and then someday these Viking invaders would come in and they would stop the lineage. And so Queen Anne ends up passing away childless, and she's the mother of this line, and there's no more lineage. But there is a cousin, and the cousin, now remember, this is Queen Anne, this is King James the First, not the second. But King James the Second is the one that wrote the Bible, and this is also going to enlighten us as to who and why they wrote the King James, and why so many people for so long thought it was the Holy Grail, the King James. You had to have the King James because it was written by inspiration. It was actually translated by Francis Bacon, who was this true royal seed from the cousin back to King Arthur. And it was somehow wielded with the Plantagenet line of Joan of Plantagenet, whose father was John, whose father was Geoffrey of Anjou, of the Plantagenet line back to Mary Magdalene. So they go up there, they married into the Celtic Welsh line of King Arthur. In fact, it's well known that line was known to be, and they claim to be, the royal line of King Arthur. In fact, the last of their descendants was an Arthur Sinclair, who was the president of the Continental Congress. And this gets so crazy. And how many people in America or anywhere in the world know that Francis Bacon literally set up expeditions to go to America and wrote down what they would do when they got there. And Sinclair and George Washington sat down and did a ritual. They were Masons, yes, but those were the good side. And they did a ritual to commemorate landing on the New World to establish the kingdom of Christ. I want to talk to you about all of this. My Vos ancestry that came to Boston and was a governor of Massachusetts, and another of my relatives that was the brigadier general in Washington's right-hand man, and these guys are all doing these sacred rituals, and we'll talk about that at some point. But so what does this have to do with St. Paul's Cathedral? Well, originally, St. Paul's Cathedral was not like the Vatican. It didn't look like that. It wasn't Greco-Roman. The original St. Paul's Cathedral was burned down in 1066 when the Norman invaders came in, the Vikings. And she died childless, and that's when this all happened. Well, it was originally Victorian style. And if you've been noticing, you've seen some pictures. I've been showing you pictures of this St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, that's the way it looked before 1066 when it was burnt to the ground. You can see the flames conflagration. It was Victorian style, not the Greco-Roman. After 1066, they rebuilt it. But who did? The Normans, the Vikings, the bad guys. So that's when all this evil started. So that's 1,000 years of the reign of Christ. And that's also coincidentally the time when the Waldensian Inquisition took place, 1130 or whatever. And that's when Peter Waldo's daughters came up there and they produced this lineage with King James. And then there was, and this was Henry. Remember, Francis Bacon is the one who wrote Shakespeare. And in Shakespeare, you'll remember the little phrase, Henry VIII, I am, I am. Henry VIII, I am. Well, there's the I am 3 times. Remember what the Lord told Moses? He says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I am who I am. Tell him I am has sent you. 3 times, I am. And so what Francis Bacon was saying is, I am that high priesthood. He's the guy with the hat. It looks like a explorer. He didn't have a priest gown. He didn't believe in the Catholics. He was a mystic who knew about Mary Magdalene, who wanted to establish that seed in America and to revive it in a prophecy that he wrote. Francis Bacon, we're going to prove, is the good guy. And we're going to go to Rosslyn Chapel. We're going to talk about the Sinclairs and who they were, and St. Bernard Clairvaux and who the Vaudios Vaux line was that changed their name to Vaux when they went to England as a Huguenot and came to Boston and named their children Vos from that point forward. All of this, wait till you get a load of all of this. I'm telling you, it is so breathtakingly interesting, and it will explain everything. It's about Victorians. So I had a discussion. This is how it started. I was trying to get to the bottom of who built Chicago. And I was like, okay, how many of these cities were burned down? Because I couldn't get AI to admit that all these cities were just here already and they didn't just came in and burned it down. Because this is what people have been thinking might be. And I thought this might be true as well, but it is kind of. But now I have all the actual facts and we can put this together. Yeah, the Huguenots and the Pilgrims that were here before 1776, there were many of them here, and they had built up cities, but it was a Victorian style. It was a architectural style of freedom. Everybody kind of built their own kind of thing. And it was red brick and spiraling peaks and, the pointy Victorian style peaks and wooden porches, a lot of red brick and cute little wooden trim around the windows and crosses and Victorian. And, early America was Victorian. But then at around this time in 1860 or so, they started in with this, what they called this. Sorry, I had to move into the house. It was getting really hot on the porch. The sun was beating down on me and I was sweating. They called it the City Beautiful movement here in America. And I don't think any American knows any of this history that I'm about to share with you. We're going to talk about the Macmillan Project, which is why there are no more Huguenots. Architecture, the Victorian era was closed, and they literally had a project to burn it all down, every city. So this is where it started. I started asking AI to tell me and admit that these buildings were here before. And I kept saying, yeah, but the golden lady with the Liberty cap, that couldn't have been something that the bad guys would have built, and certainly not out of paper mache and burn it down. And they couldn't put it together, and I couldn't yet figure out why. And I just assumed, well, this city, Greco-Roman, beautiful, must be the original Chicago. But it's not. It's them mockingly burning down in a Greco-Roman style, Holy Roman evil style, right? This is the same style they rebuilt the cathedral, Paul's Cathedral. in this Roman, Holy Roman. And by the way, they also had Gothic. They used the Gothic style for prisons and asylums and this kind of thing. They used the Greco-Roman City Beautiful movement for all the courthouses and the office government buildings and libraries and so forth. And this is what they began to do. And all across America, every courthouse was Greco-Roman dome, except for some places over in Texas which used the castle style. But both of these were from the same evil people. But the KGC originally was in Texas, and that's where they were building them. And then they went out west and started building just, on the same page, getting everybody on the same page. They didn't build courthouses that way anymore. They just built the prisons, asylums, and the orphanages and stuff out of this Gothic style. And some of their temples, like the Mormon temple. So they really did go in. They were all Masons, and they just threw this up and spent millions and millions of their dollars on building all this infrastructure to intimidate, destroy, and wipe out the seed of Christ. That's what these asylums and orphanages were, to destroy the seed of the Huguenot pilgrims who had, were Victorian individuals who were running around the whole country. But so I kept asking these questions and they wouldn't give me answers, and I thought they were lying. Well, it turns out AI doesn't really lie, but they don't know anything until you tell them. And until I could come up with an answer, they couldn't tell me. So I had to figure out a way, and I do this a lot, is I'll talk to them for hours until I find a clue or a piece that I can unravel. And I start unraveling it, and then they start to see the picture, and then they give me the information. So I started asking questions like, wait a minute, now, hold on. You say all these cities were burned down. I said, how many cities? And they're like, well, 9 cities altogether, of major cities over 100,000 people, were burned down and then rebuilt. Entire city. Remember, Chicago was burned down in 1870. The World's Fair wasn't until 1893, and then they burned that down. But the real Chicago fire was 1870. So this is when it started, and everything up until 1914, World War I, was the total reset. It started burning everything down before, even in Europe, before 1914. And by 1918, when it was over, and then you had the influenza plague, 55 million people dying, but the war killed a lot of people, and in the meantime, they were tearing down and removing, in a 50-year period, all of the ancient Victorian style for a reason. But I hadn't gotten AI to admit it yet. So I said, okay, 9 cities. Doesn't that sound a little odd? That's a lot of cities to burn down and then rebuild. And they're like, well, there was a reason, and la. So I said, hold on. Let me ask you something else. Were there other cities? What about the other major cities? Because they said that was only about 18% of the cities. And that's not major cities. That's just 18% of all the cities in the United States were burnt down and then rebuilt. And I thought, well, that's a lot, but still, what about the other cities? They said, well, they didn't want to tell me, but I said, I have to ask them specific questions. I said, were any other cities destroyed because of a flood or hurricanes or earthquakes or something? Or just demolished on purpose and then rebuilt? And they're like, yeah, all of them. Huh? Every city in America, every one of them, was demolished. Some of them because of supposed fires, they burned them down first. But the ones that weren't burned down, like Chicago was in 1870, or Buffalo or Boston or St. Louis, these ones, San Francisco, there's only 9 of them, major cities. But they said that some of them had floods, a few of them had floods, and they had to tear them down and rebuild. But a lot of them, because they said there were 14 major cities over 100,000 people, and 9 of them was burned down. But there were 9 of these cities, the other major cities, that weren't burned down, but were demolished and rebuilt. And I said, wait a minute, hold on, this doesn't sound right. And wait till you find out how they ended up destroying every city, not just the major ones. All the little towns and hamlets and villages all across America were all burned down, demolished, one way or the other, and rebuilt by 1914. And it was because of this Macmillan project, but we'll get to that. But right now, I'm just dealing with this knowledge, this revelation that all the major cities were burned down or demolished. And I said, why in the world would they do that? Well, they wanted this new City Beautiful movement. They wanted to rebuild everything with this Greco-Roman. So, all right, does that sound funny to you, Mr. AI? And they're like, yeah, well, not really. And then they gave excuses. I said, okay, tell me how many of the ancient countries or nations in the past, like Babylon, Persia, Egypt, Greece, ever in a 50-year period, burned down all of their cities and rebuilt them. This isn't right. It's not normal. You don't do that. And they're like, oh, well, actually, this actually did happen in the past quite often. And I'm like, okay, come on. You're full of crap. What you're saying is, yeah, Babylon was destroyed and they had to rebuild it. Jerusalem was destroyed and they had to rebuild it. When Babylon was taken over by Persia, they destroyed Babylon. Yes, when Alexander the Great took Egypt, he leveled Heliopolis and they had to rebuild it over in Alexandria and named it after himself. Yes, this was something that these people would do. When they would destroy a civilization, a nation would last for 70 or 100 years, and then another nation would take over, wipe them out, destroy their buildings, burn it with fire, and then rebuild it. And then they would take their obelisks and move it over to their new city. Oh, this is what they did. They brought the obelisk from Egypt and they took it to London and then they took it to Washington, the twin. So I knew that they were following the same procedure. And they always burned down the old culture, the old civilization. And then they repurposed the obelisks and named it after themselves. So this is what they did. But I started telling this to AI and a little light went on in AI's mind. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is kind of true what you're saying. And they're like, yeah, this must be what happened. But so I said, yeah, that happened in the past, but that was a political takeover, a new empire. They burned down the old empire seat of power and they rebuilt their own capital and tried to make their buildings bigger than this was going on in 1914 as well. Remember, with the Eiffel Tower being originally the tallest building, and then when they got to America, they built the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world for a while. And this is why Donald Trump, we talked about this, purchased the Empire State Building, because Donald Trump is the king of the world, right? Before that, it was Rockefeller who had the Rockefeller Plaza. Now the Trump Plaza supersedes it. And all the people from the United Nations go there and they wine and dine them with golden plates and ivory seats. So this is the plan. This is how they go. But finally, I convinced AI that it's not normal for every city to be burned down. Yeah, they would eventually rebuild the capital and make up their own tower to their own god or call it after themselves or something. And there might be one major city or two, or maybe one of the cities got flooded and they had to rebuild it. I mean, it's possible, but not all of the major cities that were, because at first they were just saying it was only 18%. And then when we started getting into it and realizing that all of them were eventually demolished and destroyed by 1914, all of them, every last one of them, a light started coming on. So then I said, was there a policy or a edict or some legislative law here in America around that time that was established that caused them to go in and burn down and demolish all the cities and then rebuild them in this Greco-Roman style? And they said, yeah. I'm like, really? There actually was, and it was called the Macmillan Plan of 1902. And that date for the Macmillan Plan explains a lot, because the major cities that were burned were usually burned before 1902. This was 1870, 1890, and in those years, the San Francisco fire and all these other fires, and Buffalo and Boston and St. Louis. But after 1902, they still had a lot to clean up. They had just gotten rid of some major cities and demolished them and rebuilt them. But what about all the towns and cities and villages around the United States? And by the way, there was something like 33 million people in the country at that time. That's a lot of people. A lot of little hamlets and villages and towns. And so they had to come up with the McMillan Plan, which was to go in and methodically tear down and demolish all Victorian architecture and start the City Beautiful movement, which is to build Greco-Roman courthouses throughout the land. And I'm like, whoa! So I said, okay, was this McMillan Plan? It was just at Washington, D.C. It was a plan that they did for Washington to clean it up and get rid of all the Victorian houses and rebuild it into the Greco-Roman style. And they said, yeah, that's where it was, but it was a model. I said, is that a model then for the rest of the country? You go, yeah, they used that as a model for the rest of the country, and they didn't call it the McMillan Plan from that point forward, but it was the plan, the McMillan Plan, and the City Beautiful Plan. And before you do the City Beautiful Plan, you got to have the McMillan Plan to demolish and destroy the Victorian ruins, culture. So this started in 1902, and from 1902 till World War I, they got rid of the rest of it, and by 1918 it was done. And then, voila, you got these Greco-Roman courthouses all over America, except for a few in Texas that I said is like the castles, but they went out and started building the asylums. So they were practicing in Texas. Lone Star, the Lone Star State. That Lone Star was a symbol of this KGC group that they merged with, and they are the ones that were very dark, started the Ku Klux Klan, Albert Pike, all of this. The white robes, the white robes that you see doctors wear, it's because they think they're priests and they're experimenting on your children. Yeah. So, it started off, they were telling me about the cities that were burned with physical disasters. There were 7 cities: New Orleans, Louisiana, water and fire. Cincinnati, Ohio, was a great flood. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, they had floods and also localized fires. Louisville, Kentucky, 1890, had a tornado and they had floods and it was completely destroyed. San Francisco, California, in 1851, they had a fire. And then they had another fire in 1906. So, they had a couple of swipes to get through that one. And Buffalo, New York, even though there was just basically this downtown theater that burned and a little bit around it, they still supposedly were having all of these local disasters, one after the other, that completely destroyed the whole hub of the town. Brooklyn, New York, had a theater fire in 1876, and one of the deadliest fires in the United States history. It destroyed Brooklyn's premier luxury theater and other buildings, I guess. And then there were 2 other cities that were destroyed by demolition. And that was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The city planners deliberately demolished the entire city and rebuilt it. Newark, New Jersey, same thing. They demolished it and rebuilt it. So now, these are not the original 9 cities that burned down, like Chicago and that. This is another group of cities. The original cities that people talk about: Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, New York, Buffalo, Baltimore, St. Louis, Missouri, Portland, Maine. Chicago was 1871, San Francisco 1906, Boston, Massachusetts 1872, Baltimore 1904, New York 1835 and 1845. That was the first one to go. St. Louis 1849. But then there's another group of cities, I guess a broader group, 18 cities: Buffalo, New York, Portland, Maine, Seattle, Washington, Spokane, Washington, Jacksonville, Florida, Chelsea, Massachusetts, Detroit, Michigan, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And they said that was 18% of all the major U.S. cities over 100,000 residents. The U.S. population in 1870 was 38,558,000. The total urban places, 663 localities, which each had a population of over 2,500. Major defined cities, 100 cities had over 10,000 residents. So the 18 cities made up 18% of the major centers of over 100,000. Then the elite metros, only 14 cities had over 100,000 residents. But they said that left 9 megacities that did not experience a fire. But they did face local disasters, floods, smaller fires, tornadoes, and deliberate mass demolition. That's what really got me thinking, man, something's going on here. So then we started talking about the ancient cities and how that's not what they did. And they were trying to tell me, oh, yeah. They were talking about how Babylon was rebuilt in 43 years, 605 BC to 562 BC. It talked about how Nebuchadnezzar built the Babylonian Ishtar Gate. He constructed the Ishtar Gate and the Etamanariki Ziggurat after it had been destroyed. Then he built the Hanging Gardens, and he fortified the city with double-walled stone brick ramparts. And I'm like, okay, but this doesn't seem, analogous to this. And then there was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's Nero, and he blamed it on the Christians. I get it. They burn stuff down, blame it on somebody else or some other reason, and then they redo the culture. So this is part of how the apostasy got going. In order to get rid of all the original culture, the Christians, who were actually more pagan, they were the pagans, they burned it down so that you don't know what was going on, and a lot of these cathedrals were then changed over from ancient pagan temples, and they just changed the placard on the front and said, okay, now this is the Christian temple or cathedral. Temples became cathedrals. And this is how they do a lot of this. It's a lot of sleight of hand. There was the Colosseum that they had to reconstruct there. And then there was Athens, Greece, 479 BC to 431 BC. It was a Greco-Persian war. The Persians completely sacked and burned Athens twice. And then there was the 50-year period of peace, and it was called the Pentacontatia. It took them 40 years to clear the rubble, and they constructed the world's most famous classic structures like the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Porphyria, which were basically creating what we now believe is the classic Greek. And all of that was made in a period of 40 years. And I'm like, okay, that sounds a little bit like here in America when everything became glass towers after 1914. So they talk about the Amarna demolition. The Egyptian pharaohs demolished some of their Akhenaten buildings, and they moved the population back to Thebes. And then they recycled the stones and built new monuments. Then Assyria, they were talking about how Sennacherib decided that the old capital wasn't big enough, I guess, and they systematically demolished it. They expanded Nineveh into a sprawling metropolis, built this palace without rival, quote, which had 2,000 rooms and had massive aqueducts. Persia, Persepolis, King Darius wanted a city that showed he was the global dominant power. So he chose a barren terrace and over a span of a few decades constructed Persepolis, which was a complex with hypo-columned halls, giant palaces, grand staircases, and it stood as a marvel until Alexander the Great intentionally torched it in 330 BC, reducing it to ruins. So I said, yeah, but that's totally different as to what was going on in America, because we weren't taken over by another foreign power or a new empire. And they're like, yeah, it was done within. In America in the 1800s, when a city was burned or demolished, the leaders didn't just patch it up, but they used a blank canvas to build something more grand. So in the 19th century, the American cities were rebuilt using the corporate wealth that they had. And they used insurance payouts and basically were accomplishing the same things that the ancient peoples did, the decree of the emperors and so forth, but they were now like this modern thing. But they were a lot like Nebuchadnezzar rebuilding the Ishtar Gate, but just doing it in modern ways with insurance scams and so forth. So no, this is what AI told me, word for word. Once I got them to see all of this, they said between 1865 and 1914, a new civilization did effectively take over America. But it came from within, they said. This was the rise of the robber barons, the monopolies, and the centralized banking syndicates, led by figures like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and the Rothschilds linked banking houses. So, to solidify their power, they required a total overhaul of the physical world. The grid system, old winding organic city streets could not accommodate the mass transit, streetcars, the automobiles required for industrial efficiency. They had to tear it down to bring in their cars and their roads and, rebuild the infrastructure and the telephone lines. And remember old John Denver? I've got rippling waters to wake me to the morning, my woman in love. Tall pine trees are pointing seedly to heaven above. Bruce flaming on the grate in the evening takes the chill away fine. Cut the telephone line, the story's the same. That's kind of a hard song to sing. I used to try and play it on my guitar, and it's a little hard to get all the words in the chorus. But I love that line, cut the telephone line. That stuck with me, and it's we need to cut the telephone line, But I'm over an hour, and I really don't want to stop right here because I want to finish telling you what the outcome of all of this is, what's really going on, what this has to do with the World Fair, because I guess tomorrow we'll start off by explaining the whole golden lady with the Liberty Cap, which proves it is the smoking gun that the reason for the destruction of all of these cities is to get rid of this Victorian style, going back to the original, before 1066, St. Paul's Cathedral. And so once we do that and we realize this is how it's connected, then we will get into the story of Sir Francis Bacon, who was the cousin of King James II. And this is a lineage that goes back to the Welsh Cadwallader of the Arthurian bloodline, as well as the Plantagenet line back to Anjou, France, who brought the royal plant or vine of the Holy Fisher Kings, and they welded the blood of Christ, the lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, into the old lineal seat or throne of David that went to Ireland, Scotland, and to Britain from the Welsh line. We'll talk about the implications of all of this. Children of Israel that were up there in Britain for 1,000 years. The first church, Christian church, Glastonbury, and on the land that they gave to the apostles when they went there, Joseph of Arimathea, but also how the Hanovers took over that line. Vlad the Impaler and Prince Charles is, yes, from one line back is the proper Stuart line, how it came to be the Stuart line from the Plantagenet line. And then, because Queen Anne died without children, they ended up putting on the throne a branch from a different line, the Hanover line, which is the illegitimate line of the present kings and queens of Britain, and the prophecies that say that one from the true line will eventually return, and the throne of David will be overturned, which means from Ireland to Scotland to Britain, and then it shall no more be overturned until he comes who has the legal right. This is a prophecy of Jeremiah, and we'll talk about how Francis Bacon said stuff like to be or not to be, and what that means, what the connotation of this is. It's very symbolic. Everything's symbolic. We're going to crack the whole parable that they wrote for us in the King Arthur legends, in the Peter Waldo Pierre Valdez legends about his wife he left in a cottage, his two daughters that went to the convent of the Plantagenet line and went over the Alps. Will trace all of their meanderings and wanderings, the true Plantagenet line that goes to Sinclair and Vaux, which went to England, became Vos, and then in Boston they changed it to VOSE, and how they became the governor of Massachusetts and the brigadier general under President Washington, and all of the American history and the orphan trains and the Huguenots and all of this that we're going to get to. But what Americans or anyone doesn't seem to understand is what this Cathedral of St. Paul represents. It was the original, and it was Victorian style. It wasn't this Greco-Roman. And so the early Huguenots and the Pilgrims, some of the Huguenots came on the Mayflower with the Pilgrims, but they came separately as well. But they were all unified and fought in the French Indian War against the Catholic French. There's a lot we got to unpack with the history of Benjamin Franklin and the Nine Sisters in France, and these Catholics and the orphan trains. Oh, guys, there's so much. But very few people know the true story of Francis Bacon. You'll hear about how there was a man with a hat that looked like Francis Bacon's style hat, and this cloak, which is the classic explorer, like Cordova, these explorer outfits that Sir Francis Bacon wore. He didn't wear a business suit or a king's outfit or a scientist or anything, but an explorer, because he was interested in getting to America and establishing the lineage, to be or not to be, and what that means. And Henry VIII, I am, because Henry VIII is his great-grandfather, which is this line that was combined with the Welsh Cadwalder and the Plantagenet line, which is the story in King Arthur pulling out the sword. We'll find out that there were prophecies that were given by Sir Francis Bacon that they would take these flat stones, lay a foundation when they got to America, do a holy ritual about the line of Christ and the establishing of this country as the New Jerusalem. And they literally did that. Arthur Sinclair and Washington and my ancestors literally went to the Northwest Territories as soon as they opened them up, took it from the Catholic French, and they did a ritual ceremony on the grounds there to establish America. Because you'll find out that these ceremonies, we're not talking about ritual, occult, dark, evil ceremonies to establish Satanism. We're talking about the good side that was actively declaring by their ceremony that they had established the kingdom of Christ. And the prophecies are that it will no longer ever be destroyed. And though the Constitution that they created will be hanging by a thread, the saints will lift it up, and we will gain victory over the beast and his image, which are those fiends that followed them here in the dark, wicked Bavarian Illuminati plot to conquer Christ and destroy and murder and pillage us all. So we'll get right back to it tomorrow, and we'll start where we left off. I hope you have a wonderful evening. The Lord loves you all. His grace and his peace will be with you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.